Well, all right. Maybe. All right. Clear? Okay. It's very good to see you all. Very good to be here once again. And as we are approaching the moment that we knew would come when we began this, it's very good to have a few last words to share and a few thoughts. First of all, I have to say, Charlie, remembering that particular quote, I'm very glad that it took root. He has exposed a weakness, though, now, so Charlie will be having to use that word yes quite a bit more. I want to say a few things. You know, the subject for the theme for our conference has been, part of it has involved newness, particularly the newness of a new humanity. And it's something that I think we have skirted and pointed toward. Probably is not possible to fully explain or define what it is that we're moving toward. But I'd like to at least spend a little bit of time just going into the newness aspect of this. Probably I'll talk a little bit about old to get to new, but we'll see how we go with this. One of the things that has become relatively clear, you know, now that medical science also goes into the psychological and spiritual aspects of the human being, is that there is a certain accelerating quality to our exposure to new things. Probably one of the things that they have demonstrated is that the effects that it has on the brain chemistry when we are around things with which we are unfamiliar or things that are new, is that it has a neurological effect. Actually, the brain hormone, dopamine, increases. And that's something that affects our mood, our motivation, many, many things. And so for many people, there is this constant desire for that which is new, a wanting, almost an addiction to the new. But in that case, we're talking about something that's more along the line of novelty. Tonight, probably I'd be talking about something different than just changing circumstances and novelty. When we talk about what's new, there are two ways that are very different of seeing what is new. On the one hand, the one that we tend to lean toward most is this idea that new is something that has never before existed, that has been invented or brought into being or discovered now for the first time. And so very often when we talk about what's new, that's what we mean. Another way in which we approach it is that there are things, ideas, conditions, states of being that have already existed, are already in existence, but for whatever reason we are seeing them for the first time. New, already existing, new, never before existing. So maybe just to get to a little bit of what might be meaningful, at least to me, I'd like to look at it through the lens of our Theosophical Society and its history. And certainly in the early days of the Theosophical Society, its history was directly linked really to one person, and that's H.P. Blavatsky. You take her out of the equation, there is no Theosophical Society. There is no other person to bring this movement into being. So with her, she of course had a very interesting life. At 17 years old, she left home and started traveling the world, something that would be the feature of her life until the end of her days, almost. But she traveled for very specific reasons, even at 17. She was traveling and placing herself in the presence of the deep esoteric teachings of the world, acquainting herself with mentors of a very varied and deep nature. When she started her travels, she went to Turkey, she went to Greece, she was in Egypt, she came to North and South America, and this is at a time when you weren't getting on and off jet planes. This was at a very, very different nature of travel and difficulty. But at 17, she started this journey. And so that was something that continued for her. In her early years, she had had experiences of the presence of someone who she regarded as her teacher. Great presence. She even had incidents where in her life there was a physical intervention where her life was in danger and it was spared in various different ways. But she had this vision and she could see the person, had seen the face, but not in a physical form. At 20 years old, she found herself in London. And at 20, she was in the streets of London observing this passing procession of Indian princes. And in that group of princes that was walking the street, she saw for the very first time, in physical form, her master. The way the story went, she tried to run to him, and knowing Blavatsky, she would have fallen at his feet and everything like that, but he made some sign. He did something with his hand, and she stopped. She held back. Later the same evening, while she was walking, thinking about this experience, thinking about having finally made physical contact with the person who was her teacher, she was walking, and then she actually met him in the flesh. And it was at this point that he described to her something about the future that lay ahead for her, that her life was one that was going to require additional level of training, but that it was something that he told her she would be involved, that her role was to bring into being a movement. None of the details of that movement were specifically described, but that it related to this ageless wisdom. And then her travels continued. And for the next 20 years, she was again continuing her contact with very high beings. She made her way to India. She was there for a number of years, actually. And when she came out, she found herself in Paris, 1873. And it was at that point that she says that her master said that it was time to begin this, and that really the future that was awaiting her lay in America, in the United States. For someone like HPB, it was something that was very, very attractive, because one of the things that specifically attracted her was that in the United States at that time, there was this movement that was occurring. Very dynamic, very well-known movement. Spiritualism, and this was right up her alley. The idea of people, a communication, a bridging between the physical world and the people who had departed to the other side, was something being reported in the newspapers and incidents of it all across the United States. So the way she described it, going to the United States for her was like coming to Mecca. She was just thrilled with the idea. And it was there that she met Colonel Olcott. Both of them were involved in observing a particular seance, a particular scene of spiritualism at the Eddy brothers' farm, where these two brothers had these really very pronounced capacity for this communication. Olcott was there to observe it because he was someone who, if he could, he would debunk it, but if he couldn't debunk it, then he could promote it. So he was the person who had scales to check the weight of the place where the mediums were sitting to see if it changed when these apparitions appeared. He had all sorts of ways that he tried to test this. One of the things that he noticed was that when HPB arrived on the scene, all of a sudden the level of phenomena that had been occurring, and these were remarkable phenomena. I mean, for us, it may not be our normal experience, but these mediums, there were actually people that were appearing and speaking to the people in the room, people who were on the other side. But when HPB arrived, for everyone there, the level of these phenomena suddenly shifted. And a type of person, Asiatic people in dress that Americans couldn't even imagine, didn't know it existed, started to appear. And in large measure, she said that part of it was something that she attracted, but part of it was something that she actually manifested. We can talk a little bit more about that. But after that meeting is when, of course, in 1875, and for us we know it well because it was 150 years ago that the Society was founded in New York City, in the United States of that time. So, a little bit about the environment in which this new endeavor took root. The United States at the time that HPB and Olcott and the others involved brought this society into being was a country that was 99 years old. It was new. It was fresh. It was a baby among nations. I mean, my mother is 107. She's not a nation. She's a person. But a nation that was 99 years old, it was new. It was in its formative stages. It was a nation that when HPB and Olcott formed this society, it was a mere 10 years after the laws of the land had changed so that it was no longer legal to own, to sell people as property. 10 years prior, the slavery, if you were of African descent, there was the possibility of sale. The laws of the country supported at that time were much more supportive of mistreatment of a horse or a dog than of a human being of African descent. This was the nation that she came to. And this was the nation where a society that later on would take on universal brotherhood regardless of race, caste, and all of the other distinctions, had its initial formation. It's remarkable. It was a society that had just experienced, again, 10 years prior, a civil war. A war in which fully 1 out of every 50 people in the nation was killed in that war. Every family was affected. Every household had been touched. And out of that, in this medium, you had this movement of spiritualism that arose. Clearly, among a people, there was this deep longing to get in touch with loved ones very recently lost in this war. And that longing seemed to have brought into being. There were people always who had this sort of sensitivity to, sensitivity to other realms. But these people became quite prominent at this time. The need that was called forth by this intense longing brought these people to the fore. And so this was what HPB was there to research, to study, and also to use as a platform to present this deeper view that theosophy was intended to provide. Initially, her charge was to create a philosophical, spiritual organization. It took on the name of theosophy, and it was HPB who was called upon to fill in the teachings. And it was teachings that related really to the ancient wisdoms. At that time, I wouldn't say it was specifically focused on the ageless wisdom, but that's something we can talk about a little bit maybe later on. But 1877, she wrote her first book. Probably I should just say, in this medium, HPB came into this and introduced this movement. You had a new nation, you had a new people that were streaming into this country from all around the world, primarily from Europe, but a large percentage of people were coming also from China, something that was unrealized. New people, new nation, new movement, and here she comes. In all of this ferment of newness that had yet to settle, to introduce the ideas that had went on to become what we recognize as theosophy. 1877, she wrote her first book, Isis Unveiled, which if I were to ask, someone here must know. What's the full title of the book, Isis Unveiled? Let me just shout it out. Wow. Where's Pedro when we need him? Isis Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology. A master key to the mysteries involved in science, whether you look back or whether you looked to the contemporary science, and theology, religious practice of the time. But it was a book that did a very strong comparison and contrasting, and that really pointed very strongly to the inadequacies of contemporary science and contemporary religion. The many places where it did not line up with what was being disregarded as non-progressive and old. The ancient wisdom that she pointed to from many, many sources. And so that was where she came, she wrote her book, she introduced these ideas. So, again, to get back to what's new, and the idea that it's a question that is worth asking from time to time. In this setting, with this introduction in this medium, what was new? Ancient wisdom, but again, it was a wisdom that was not current at all in America or Europe of that time. I mean, one of the ideas that she stressed so strongly, throughout her time, was the importance of some sort of grasp of these intertwined but key ideas of reincarnation and karma. Those are ones that we struggle with to this day. There is no possibility for us to comprehend the full workings of karma, but the understanding of it necessarily implies this reincarnation process. But these were ideas, they're ideas that now are in any dictionary in any country in the world. Every encyclopedia includes sections about these things, but they were exotic and largely unknown in the America of that time. Further elaborations of ideas like the multi-dimensional nature of the human being. It evolved into the idea of 7 planes, but the multi-dimensional nature of the human being and of the cosmos within which we live, those were unheard of ideas completely new, revolutionary. In fact, her book, when she wrote it, it was something of a bestseller. They wrote it, they published the number of books they wrote, sold out, they had to redo it again. Very, very popular book. So that idea, the idea that we live in a world that is in a universe where there's no such thing as empty space. Intelligence is omnipresent, is one of these exotic new ideas of an ancient sort that she brought to this explanation, this budding explanation of the theosophical view. So many, many things. And largely this idea of the unity of all life was new, was dynamic, and attracted a great deal of attention, and a great deal of attention from variety of quarters. I mean, part of the thing that she had going for her too was that she was able to produce all sorts of phenomena at will. And when she would have her salons in New York City and all of these different people would be there, they would be very impressed by some of the things she would do. HPB was a chain smoker. And she was so good and she smoked so much she could talk, write, and roll a cigarette with one hand, they say. She was skilled. But, you know, on occasion she would have left her pouch of tobacco somewhere, and you know, you read letters from people. There's a very good book by Daniel Caldwell called, is it The Inner Life of HPB or the, do you know, I turned to Pedro because he's or the occult life of, or the esoteric world of HPB, where it's a book really of letters of people who were her contemporaries, and people who liked her and people who didn't, but people who were there to witness things that they couldn't deny. And so one of these things is that she'd be there talking, rolling a cigarette, she'd realize she left her tobacco in another room, and she would summon the pouch of tobacco. And you know, everybody would look, and here the pouch comes across the room, undeniably in her hand. You know, so she would do all kinds, produce objects, you know, where there was none. Hopefully many of you got a chance to go to our museum. In there you can see some of the drawings, objects, teacups that were produced in this manner. So clearly, you know, if I put myself in that room where this stuff is happening, she would have captured my interest, without any doubt. I would want to know more. And so this was what occurred. The people were drawn to her, and out of these phenomena, she would try to give a deeper explanation of the powers that are latent within, of the connections that we have with other dimensions of our own being, and of the capacity to interact with those, even to the point where she was, where you can command them. And so that was the approach that was attempted at that time. It was an approach that attracted many people, but you know, as is the case with interest, there's always something new that it can go to. So there were a few people that found it of value sufficiently to go on and explore more deeply. She was, for about 5 years, they remained in the US. She continued to write, continued to teach, before, in the end of the year, 1878, she and Colonel Alcott picked up and moved everything, their operations, to India. They had been in communication with many people in India, and there was a movement in India that aligned very closely with the Theosophical movement. And they came here believing that to come to this country, you know, they left from the New World the newness of a developing world of the West, and came to probably not just the old world, but in coming to India, they came to the oldest world in terms of a continuously alive and operating spirituality. And so in coming here, what was new? And here really, I have to say this everywhere. The Theosophical Society was founded in New York, in the United States. I'm from the US, I'm proud. But it came to life in India. It came to life here. Well, this isn't a nationalistic statement, it's a fact. Here is where it came to life. And it came to life for a number of reasons. But one of them was that while they came here, the spirituality of India was millennia. It had been in existence for millennia. The time they arrived here was a changing time. At that time, it was the British Crown. India was one of those colonies in the crown of the British Empire on which the sun never set. And India was one of those places that was enriching a foreign place and was in the process of not only taking on some of the qualities of the colonizer. It's an interesting feature of colonial history. There are certain requirements in order for someone to play the role of colonizing another place. And one of the distinct requirements is that at some level, one has to consider themselves superior to the ones who are being colonized. Britain. And as part of that, all of the ways of the British Empire, of the British people, were the ways that were promoted, the ways that had been in existence and flourishing here for thousands of years were not only denied, but suppressed. And so you found HBB, Olcott, on this soil, and finding that a deep spirituality being suppressed, but also suffering from what can happen with years and years of formal practice, that it becomes, much of the deeper truth become masked to yourself. That so much of it had been involved in formulaic approach to the deep truths that are hidden under normal religious practice. And here these two Westerners come and start speaking about the deep truths in the religious practice, the spiritual practice of this place, and refusing to allow those to be suppressed, and encouraging others to take on the same thing, to rediscover those truths. And so that was the newness of what they brought to this place, and out of that, it flourished. It grew. In this place, they started to talk about the ageless, not the ageless, the ancient wisdom that was inherent to India. And it started to spread to other places around the world. Also, one of the things that occurred, the Theosophical Society, when it was founded, as was said by, I think, N.C. Krishna earlier, it had one object. Now we think of three objects as something that is almost divinely ordained, that from the very beginning it was three. It was one in 1875, which was to study and diffuse the knowledge of the workings of the laws of the universe. It was a big one. And that was it. If you look at the evolution of the objects evolved from one object. The next time that they appeared as printed objects, there were 6. After that, it was 7. Then they said, well, maybe we've got too many, let's go to 4. Finally, it arrived at 3, close to the ones that we're familiar with now. But it wasn't until a very few years, I mean, all of this occurred during H.P. Blavatsky's lifetime, but it wasn't until a very few years after she died that to me was what to me is a very, very important change in those objects occurred. And it's a change that was a matter of switching one 3-letter word and one 1-letter word to a different position. The objects, when they got to 3, were to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood. In that time after HPB died, that objects changed by saying to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood, which may seem like a small thing, but quite honestly, in its beginnings, the Theosophical Society has evolved. It has continually evolved and unfolded into new directions. In its beginnings, when they were beginning in New York in that hall where everybody signed on, the 16 people that were the first members, it was basically a men's club composed mainly of people of European descent and, the few who had been in America for more than a generation. But it was a club of sorts, the way most of the people in that room conceived of it. Initially, Alcott had thought to develop this society, and it was going to be called the Miracle Club. He tried to do it. The Miracle Club, to kind of address the phenomenal occurrences that we would regard as miracles in the setting of this club of people. But the focus on a universal brotherhood was a focus on a separative, a group of individuals, a universal brotherhood, like a brotherhood of Masonics or brotherhood of whatever else. The universal brotherhood of humanity became the focus that has guided us ever since. So anyway, in India, it flourished, it grew, it went out to other places in the world. HPB lived, HPB left here. She was here for 6 years. The remaining 6 years of her life she spent in Europe, ending up in London, which is where she wrote the master works that we are very familiar with. But the society continued. With her passing, the foundation was laid, but a new wave, a new group of leadership and of attention and interest took root. And so you had Annie Besant, C.W. Leadbeater. That particular wave took root. And it was the same focus on theosophy, but different. Clairvoyant in examination and investigation became a strong focus. Clairvoyance in general became a focus. Because of Annie Besant, the idea that these deep truths also have application in the world and to our lives became something that was stressed. HPB in the early ones had to give us the basis, give us the wisdom that could then be developed. It was unheard of. A.P. Sinnett had to develop the language to express it, but Annie Besant and them took it to another level. I mean, we're blessed today. We have an artist in residence who was exposed to this clairvoyant vision of other planes of existence, and it resonated. And so, 100 years later, the effects of that wave is still being felt. Another wave, Annie Besant lived, Annie Besant died. C.W. Leadbeater lived and he left. And then the next wave of people came in, and you had the Sri Ram, J. Krishnamurti, Radha Bernier. And at least to the way that I see it, these are people whose focus, while maintaining all of the focus of Theosophy as it had developed and evolved, brought a different lens to the way that we see it, in the sense that there was the strong focus on the mind, the use, the understanding of the mind, and the understanding of the way that it can be expansive and also be limiting. And that was where there was so much focus lay. It was, in many ways, it brought the psychological element to the application of Theosophy. So this is historical. This is what brought us to now. And so when we look at now, we look at the conditions and the situation in which we live. You know, what's new? What is it that is new about our world? There are probably many, many things we could describe. One thing that is certainly new, in 1875, the global population was just a little bit over 1 billion people. It's a lot of people. But today, you have a population that exceeds 8 billion people. Maybe that's a small thing, but we'll talk about it in a minute. Back in 1875, if I wanted to send a letter from the US to India, it would take months to get it if you were lucky for it to arrive. Actually, I should say, I had the longest time it ever took for me to have a letter delivered was, I think, a year and a half. Somebody sent me a postcard from somewhere. They were on vacation, and this is back to the younger people here. They may not be aware of a time when people were sending postcards. But this was at a time they were on a trip somewhere in North Africa, and they sent me a postcard, just, you know, one of those wish you were here things. A year and a half later, it arrived in my mailbox. So in 1875, the mail to India would have been faster, but it would have taken months. In 1875, if you wanted to travel, a steamship was the most modern, fastest way that you would get from one place to another. You know, these were the conditions of the time. Our time is very different. This whole matter of the population, if you think about it, 8 billion people, it's an absolutely unprecedented figure, unprecedented number of human beings walking and populating the planet as far as the entire planet's history. Never has there been such a thing as this. So there are 8 billion people walking the earth, interacting in the ways we do, carrying around with them the personalities that they have developed and that they brought over. So that's one thing that is going on. But, you know, as people who are students of an ageless wisdom tradition, we know that birth involves more than a body. It involves more than a personality. That the animating principle inhabiting each and every one of these 8 billion people is what we would describe as the soul. So you have a time a moment in the Earth's history. An unprecedented number of souls have, for some reason, incarnated at this time. And, you know, why? What is it that is so attractive about this particular moment within which we live? I mean, when we look, what I tend to hear most is about the difficulties of these times. Many people talk about the darkness and all the different things like that. For me, I take the approach, this is probably one of the most wonderful times to be alive, for a number of reasons. Obviously, with this large influx of souls, there are souls that are of all different stages of development. This is something that's consistent with what we know. So you have very young souls, souls whose past and whose karma and whose expression requires dense, physical sorts of experiences. The experiences that can be found in all of the various fields that we would describe maybe as destructive. The problem with, it's not a problem, but it's a fact. Well, you have very young souls. You also have very old souls. And just by virtue of the numbers, the influx, it would be safe to assume that at this time that we find ourselves living, there are more of a group of old souls, souls who did not come to destroy, souls who came to envision and to build the vision of a sustainable humanity, of a new humanity. They're present here in the world. And so as a time to be alive, it's a wonderful time. Because one of the things that you find, while it just seems as if almost every single day there is some new form, some new atrocity, that it was like, how did anybody even dream of doing something this destructive, this debased? Those things recur. But what does not make that news is, something like this. What does not make that news is something like a group of hundreds of people engaged in a global meditation and understanding what they're doing, able to still the mind, able to visualize themselves as a consciousness embracing a planet, and able to stand in a way apart from the chaos, apart from the noise, and interact with the consciousness of the planet as a whole. That, at least, I don't know what newscasts you all watch, but it doesn't come on my station. It's certainly not in the United States. It's a wonderful time. Humanity at this time, one of the things that is new, humanity has literally become a force of nature. We, maybe not in the best way, but when we talk about climate change, you're not talking about some natural progression of the climate or of the planet. We're talking about collective human behaviors that are so pronounced and so ingrained, and we are so unwilling to alter and to change that it's affecting the climate. We know that. So these are all new conditions, new situations that have not existed before. And so faced with that sort of thing, to people who have their eyes open and to people who, at the minimum, don't want to despair, at the constant projection of dark things and divisions and separations, what do you do? How is this something that can be addressed? There was a poet, I should say too, when it comes to the perception of deeper realities, a good place to look first is to the various artists of the world, to the poets, to the artists, to the people who bring music into this world, to the people who are seeing the world through the lens of perhaps an intuitive understanding. But there was a poet, William Wordsworth, part of a poem. He said, "With an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and by the deep power of joy, we see into the nature of things." With an eye that looks at surfaces, made quiet by the power of harmony, by exposing ourselves to that which is harmonious, a moment such as this, and by the deep power of joy, the intuitive vision of the world lies open before us. We see into the nature of things, and the nature of things sees through us. It's a poet describing a moment of realization. To further cement that point, another poet, first line of one of his poems says, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." Let's focus on joy. There is a contemporary musician, I think he's gone now. Yeah, he's died. He had a line in one of his songs. He was really talking about many things, but he said, "Jesus taken seriously by many, taken joyously by a few." Something that I love. We could say the same thing about HPB, honestly. I tell you, I know so many people, many of us here, we take HPB so seriously that the joy that animated her entire existence, nobody goes through all of the things that HPB went through just to have your name on a book or whatever else. There were no rewards to what she was doing. The reward was a connection with a deep and abiding joy that allowed her to endure that. You take other people, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King. It's a long list of people who were able to express something of a deeper nature that arose from a vision that they were able to see that was rooted in a joy that opened a door. And so this joy, and just to be a little bit clear, we don't want to confuse joy with happiness. The two are very much related, of course. But happiness is more of a symptom of something else. Happiness occurs when desires momentarily die down. You want the ice cream, you get it, you're happy. You want the ideal mate, the soul mate, they say yes, you're happy, and then you have to live together. And then, then is when joy, the joy that sustains those things. Happiness is a different thing. In Buddhist practice, there's this thing that's called the four immeasurable minds, the Brahma Viharas, the places where Brahma lives, you could say. One of them relates to joy. And it's this immeasurable mind, much like what we did with this meditation today. May all beings, so you conceive of all beings, may all beings have joy. And in that particular form of practice, joy is conceived in this way. An example is sometimes given. What is joy? How can you describe it? And so the description is to imagine a person lost in the desert. And if you've been out in the desert for a while, you're quite thirsty. And so a thirsty person who, looking up ahead, sees an oasis, palm trees, springs of water. But the oasis is only a mirage. But the internal sense that occurs is what could be described as joy. The person doesn't know it's a mirage. No desire has been satisfied. They haven't drunk a drop of water. But internally, this state of joy arises. So the idea being that this is a state of being that is continuously available to us if we learn how to avail ourselves of it. And so that's this opening. For me, this is the avenue that our avenue toward what we could describe as a new humanity, to a new understanding of what it means to be human. And in many ways it may seem as if to say find joy and we'll be all right doesn't differ much from people giving you all of the other platitudes. Don't worry, be happy. How's that been working? But I think it's a little bit different. And for me, one of the beauties of this experience of being here in Adyar, one of the beauties of this experience of being here in the world has been that we have an opportunity to test these things. And one of the ways in which we test it here, or at least from my perspective, I can't blame my view on anybody else. One of the ways, many things, we've been able to watch appear before our eyes, things that didn't exist before, perhaps. Here in this place, it's been sort of a laboratory for many of us. And how has it happened? People might say this whole joy concept, prove it. Yeah. But how do you do that? But the proof has been this to me, that from an organizational sense, this is an organization, the Theosophical Society. And always there are organizational sorts of approaches, lots of books written about the subject, those sorts of things. Where does joy fit into any of this? At least my experience has been this, that joy by its very nature, first of all, of course, it inspires, but also it opens us to a deeper level of vision. I mean, just think about the times when that's been your experience. It opens us to a deeper vision, to a higher understanding. It permits a certain type of guidance. It's magnetic. It attracts to us others who can foster and magnify this. It attracts us to others who share the same mind. Here, I have witnessed, where you have a person with a capacity for joy. We all have it, but very often our experience has been that sometimes life has wounded us to the point where it's covered, deeply covered, and it's a hard job to get to it. And it's much, much easier to accept what Sangeeta Menon described the other night about, our meaning is determined by our function. So wherever we're plugged in the world, it's much, much easier to accept that. But where you see the potential for joy, you also see the potential for vision. And at least for me, where there is a joyful person, if you can find that person and then try to empower them, it spreads. It's something that it magnifies itself through others, where you get collectives of these sorts of people people who understand it, then remarkable things happen. And so, and it's infectious. I mean, it's the disease we all want to get. It infects others. And so, at this point, in the face of much of what we might describe as darkness, there should also be the memory, the recognition that wherever you have light, necessarily you have shadow. Where you have great light, you have pronounced shadow in the world. And all of us are here. Each one of us came into this world with a particular background, with particular capacities. And I can remember when I first became associated with Theosophy and was in Chicago, had a mentor. He dealt almost exclusively with younger people. So at that time I was 20 years old, and others around me were in this group were of a similar age. And it was a time where many of those young people were deep, old souls. I mean, people who were deeply connected, obviously, with this, had a connection to something higher, universal. But then I also witnessed how, at that time, how many of them got moved away from this pathway that they were on through a number of different things. Drug use was one. You know, the artificial stimulation of the senses and of the insights took some of them away. You know, some of them became involved in spiritual practices that, you know, were spiritual in name, but degrading in nature. They went to the side. You know, as you move on, one by one, you find it's a small crowd walking on. But all of that, I say, not as some sort of a definition of what it is that is the new humanity, or what it is that, but we're here to experience the new. We are here to bring in what is new. The extent to we know it will be indicated by the extent that we are infected with some sense of joy. So I think really, rather than go on, I think maybe that I will leave it at that the thing that is the need of the moment, the thing that is the need of the world, the thing that is our individual need is all around us at every moment. The power of harmony, the power of deep joy is the need for a renewal to this humanity. So I think I'll stop there. And I thank you very much for listening.